Welcome to Guildhall Library. Some of you may have been to some of our previous talks this week or last week, and I was told off for not introducing myself at those talks. So my name is Dr. Peter Ross, and I'm Principal Librarian at Guildhall Library. Because after the talk I did yesterday, somebody said, "Do you work here?" I said, "Yes, I do." So that's the reason I'm presenting these talks to you for English Tourism Week. And they are talks, as I've said on the previous occasions, that come out of the collections. They come out of material that we come across just because people are reading material that we often hand back to us. We think, well, that's interesting, what's that? And we learn about things that people are actually using them. And we try to research the background to some of these more interesting items. But the one today is just slightly different in the fact that this really is my subject. The previous ones have been subjects that I've learned about here. But Jack Sheppard is a subject I've researched for about 25 years, can you believe? And it started off when I read a Daniel Defoe novel, and I thought, this is really good. I'll read another Daniel Defoe novel. I read about 6, and I started reading his short works, one of which is meant to be a narrative of Jack Sheppard. In fact, it's not by Defoe, and it's not a fiction like people used to think. It's factual detail about Jack Sheppard. So I became interested in, I thought, I'd research his life, and I'd research his legend. And about 20 years after starting, I eventually ended up with a PhD in the subject, mostly about his legend. So this is more about his life. But when I did my research, I came here to do it. Before I even worked here, I came and researched the life of Jack Sheppard, because we have records here relating to him, including records of his apprenticeship, etc. So this talk is normally longer than about the half an hour I've got, so I might do it as fast as I can, so bear with me. Some bits I might have to read, because some of it is a bit detailed, and I can't necessarily remember all the details after researching it for so long. I've forgotten some of them, actually. So let's get started. Okay, so Jack Sheppard was born in 1702, so we just need to look at what London would have looked like at that sort of period. So this is London in about the 1720s. And you can recognise much of its shape. Here's the city, just here. These are the suburbs going out along the Mile End Road, down into the Docklands area, a bit of the borough, Southwark, along to Westminster, not much beyond Westminster, and virtually nothing beyond what we now call Oxford Street. So quite a small city, but still a dramatically big city for the 18th century. So that's the city we're talking about of Jack Sheppard's time, so the early 18th century. So Jack was born in 1702 in this street. This is the only old picture I can find of this street. This is White's Row in Spitalfield. So he was a local lad. He was the son of a carpenter. His father was Thomas Sheppard. He was a carpenter and a citizen of London. So he was a master craftsman. Jack was the third son. The oldest son was Thomas. The second son was called John, who died as a baby. The third one, now Jack, was called John, but he's always known as Jack. And the youngest child was a girl called Mary, who died when she was a child. Their father died before Jack could remember him. That's what Jack said. He couldn't remember his father. We think his father died when Jack was about 4 or 5. And his mother was left with 2 sons to look after. She had a daughter. The daughter died shortly after. Left with 2 sons to look after. So as her husband had been a citizen of London and a carpenter, she probably, and I say probably, applied to the workhouse, applied to the city to get them a place at the workhouse, because that was an opportunity. They're regarded as orphans, even though they've got a mother still alive. She couldn't train them in a particular trade. So she applies to the city, and they go to the workhouse not as punishment like they did in the 19th century, though people were punished here. Children were sent there because there might be orphans of a parish in order to be trained in a particular trade. And it's usually some of those quite basic trades like carpentry and shoemaking, not the higher trades like mercers and goldsmiths. They didn't come out of the workhouses. So Thomas and his brother, Jack and his brother Thomas, were probably sent here. And this building obviously no longer exists. It's under platform 17 of Liverpool Street Station, about that position. But don't think of it as a 19th century Oliver Twist type of workhouse. It was different to that. He was probably possibly taught to read and write, but probably just taught to read. And he still would have been taught a trade, or getting set up to be put into a trade. The idea was that you get them to 14, and then you apprentice them to somebody. And you may pay the master a fee to take them from the workhouse. So Jack had some advantages. His father was, as I say, was a master carpenter, so the Carpenters' Company had an interest in the orphans, the Carpenters' Guild. But Jack also seems to have had somebody who was looking after the family to a certain extent, and this is a man called William Kneebone. He was a very wealthy, well, fairly wealthy woolen draper who lived in that house there. So this is on the Strand. This is the Maryland Strand, which is actually built after Jack would have known these Roman buildings. But that is William Kneebone's shop and house that survived into the 19th century, in fact. So a woolen draper who had some interest in the family. We're not quite sure why. It seems that Jack's mother had gone to work for William Kneebone as a servant in the house. There may have been some connection with Jack's father at some point, and he may have employed Jack's father. But William Kneebone was a nonconformist, he was married, he had no children, and he seems to have taken Jack under his wing and possibly used him as a servant in his house. So Jack's already got some advantages over the ordinary orphans who might be in that workhouse. Unfortunately, his brother got up to no good very quickly. Yeah, I showed this picture the other day when we were talking about Elizabeth Canning. His brother got involved in his crime. His brother had been apprenticed to a carpenter and had eventually stolen some carpentry tools. And he had been tried at the Old Bailey, found guilty, and he was burnt in the hand. And if you weren't here when we were talking about Elizabeth Canning, burning in the hand was a punishment whereby you were branded on the ball of the thumb. It was a punishment also to mark you that you'd been tried for a certain level of crime. And then if you were caught again, they knew that you'd been found guilty of that sort of level of crime, and you couldn't then get that punishment again. You'd have to get a more serious punishment. It was a way of literally marking people as criminals. So Thomas had got into trouble. And then, this is about now 1723, so Jack has been apprenticed to a man called Owen Wood, a very good name for a carpenter, who lived in this street, Wych Street. He lived in Drury Lane and then in Wych Street. Jack had been apprenticed from William Kneebone's house here to a master carpenter here, and Jack had seemed to have carried out his apprenticeship fairly well until about the 6th year of his apprenticeship. Apprenticeship's usually 7 years. About the 6th year, in about 1723, Jack appears to have met a woman called Elizabeth Lyon, who has come down in history known as Edgeworth Bess. She was from Edgware. She's always referred to as Edgeworth Bess. Even in records, she's referred to as Edgeworth Bess. She's thought to have been older than Jack, probably in her 20s. She was larger than Jack. They imply that she was a big woman. She was clearly a prostitute. So he probably met her down the pub, and she encouraged him to start doing minor robberies, stealing things from houses he was working as a carpenter, probably to give her gifts. That's the implication, that's what he said happened. But then, if you read criminal stories in the 18th century, they always blame some woman for encouraging big things. And it's usually a prostitute. But she did exist, she was tried, she was transported in the end, she was a prostitute, did exist. So he started to rob people around these streets here. So I just need to read a section of that, just to give you some idea of what he was getting up to. So what he seems to have been doing was using the skills he had as a carpenter to understand how to break into particular buildings. So just bear with me a moment. Right. So this is 1723-24. Jack committed his first act of housebreaking choosing Mr. Baines as his victim. He'd already stolen something from Mr. Baines' shop. But Jack Sheppard's great skills in housebreaking. So he removed the bars of Mr. Baines' kitchen window at the back of Mr. Baines' house, and that was in White Horse Yard, which is just on the map here. He got up into the shop and he stole £7 from the till and goods worth £14. He left by the street door, locking it after him, and then replaced the bars he cut at the back window. He did this so well that Mr. Baines blamed a servant in the house for the break-in and had no idea that he'd actually been broken in through the back window. After this robbery, Jack probably left his master, so Owen Wood was deserted. He went off with Edgeworth Bess, and for a time they might have lived in Fulham. In October 1723, Sheppard was lodging with a Mr. Charles in Mayfair, and on the 23rd of that month, he stole £7 10 shillings, 5 large silver spoons, 6 plain silver forks, 4 teaspoons, 6 plain gold rings, a cipher ring, 4 suits of cloth, and some linen. So, That's a very large amount of material to steal at that time. Nobody knew he'd done that until he confessed after he'd been caught. He confessed to that crime. He was never accused of it. Sometime in the late 1723-24, he joined up with his brother, who had been released, and Edgeworth Best, to form a sort of loose gang. On the 5th of February 1724, Jack and Thomas broke into the house of Mary Cook, a linen draper of Clare Street, again, just in that area, and they stole goods worth £55. That's a very large sum of money in 1723. On the 14th of Feb, they broke into the house of William Phillips and stole goods from somebody who occupied the house. Then eventually, Jack was found in a pub, having been impeached by his brother, and was arrested. So those were his first crimes, fairly major crimes in the 18th century. But he was arrested, and he was sent to this place. This is St Giles in the Field Lockup. St Giles Roundhouse it's called, even though it's square. This is basically somewhere where if somebody was arrested for drunkenness, arrested for any crime, and you needed to take them before the magistrate the next day, you had to put them somewhere. So you put them in a parish lockup. So Jack was put into this lockup. He was put onto the top floor, and he was basically left there overnight. The watch should have been, they were probably downstairs here. What he did was he broke his chair up, he went through the ceiling of his cell, went through the roof, climbed on the roof, and he knocked some tiles down. This is a 19th century image of what's going on. And a crowd started to gather around, saying there was shouting out, there's somebody on the roof of the roundhouse. He climbed down the back. You have to imagine this is night time. He climbed down the back into the churchyard, and then he ran round and joined the crowd and pointed to the roof saying, there he goes. That's his first major escape. He'd already rescued Edgeworth Best from a lockup previously, just by bursting in, punching the lockup keeper and dragging her out. This is his first major escape from a lockup. But very rapidly, you find that Jack Sheppard gets caught all the time, because all he does is he goes back to that area around Drury Lane and the Strand. He's got nowhere else to go, so he goes back there because he knows people around there. He's probably friends with a loose gang of criminals that live around that area. So he goes back there, he gets arrested again, and he gets sent to this place. This is the new prison at Clerkenwell. It's just up near London Metropolitan Archives, if you know where that is, just north of Clerkenwell. Parts of it remain under the ground. If you go under the car park of some flats that we converted from school, there are bits of the new prison that still remain, but nothing above the ground. He was sent here. Edgeworth Best came to visit him the next day, was arrested, and regarded as his wife by this time, and was put into a cell, what they thought was the most secure cell in the new prison, on an upper floor. And this is what happened. So, over a number of days, Jack seems to have had a number of tools brought to him by visitors, a file, and he started to file through the bars of his prison. In fact, this is again a 19th century image. The bars that he was filing through were actually thick oak beams. They weren't metal bars, but incredibly thick. So over a number of days, he managed to file through those bars. Clearly, when people were locked up, they were left until they were taken for trial. So people just brought them food and left them for hours on end. So he was able to do this. So he filed through the bars, and he looked down, basically, and realised it was 23 feet to the ground. So what he did was he got his blankets, and he got Edgeworth Best to strip off most of her clothes, leaving just her shift, and tied them into a rope. And you can see this one, there's much more like it probably was with these thick wooden bars. And then he lowered Edgeworth Best into the yard outside. Now, everyone, when you ever read about this, say Edgeworth Best was a big woman. Jack Sheppard was only 5'5" tall, he was very slight. But he was obviously incredibly strong from doing his work as a carpenter. He lowered her down there, and then he climbed down afterwards. But then they realised they were in a yard that had a 20-foot wall around it, so they were basically out of the frying pan into the fire. He had some tools with him, including a gimlet, a bit like a screwdriver. And he realised that if he put several of these gimlets up the hinge of the gate, he could actually make himself a ladder. He climbed up these gimlets onto the top of the wall, pulled Edgeworth Best up behind him, then lowered her down the other side of the corridor, and they were away. They made their escape. And they returned back to exactly the same place they were from. So they returned back to this area we've seen before. These dots, these red dots, mark places where he either lived for instance here, or where he robbed. So you can imagine the whole area must have known. You always know that the type who lives down the street that causes all the trouble. They must have known that it was him doing most of these things. But what he did this time, clearly he was getting more brazen. He decided to break into the house of William Kneebone, who had employed him and employed his mother, and might have paid for his apprenticeship. So William Kneebone's house is there, it's that red dot there. So what he did was, he, with a man called Blueskin Blake, who's called Blueskin Blake in the records, his name, his first name was, I've forgotten his first name anyway, Blueskin Blake, Joseph was his first name, was a bit of a much nastier criminal than Jack Sheppard. Blueskin Blake had been involved in a murder of a Chelsea pensioner before this time. Anyway, they formed a small gang. They went in the back alley, which is called Denham Yard here, and they broke into William Kneebone's house and shot whilst the Kneebone family were upstairs. And they stole an enormous amount of cloth and other things from William Kneebone's house, and then made a getaway. So that's, just remember, there's Blueskin Blake and Jack Sheppard were the people responsible for doing that. Kneebone gets up in the morning and he realises he's been robbed, and what he does is he goes to this man. This is Jonathan Wild. So there's no detective prison force at this period, so if you want something investigated, then you have to do it yourself, or you have to find somebody to do it for you. Kneebone recognised that Jack Sheppard could be the only person who had broken into his house. And he was sent to this place, which is Newgate Prison. The strongest prison in London, notorious for terrible conditions. If you went down into the basement of it as a prisoner and you walked around, it said that the lice were crunchy underfoot as you walked around. So that's the sort of conditions we lived in. Jack was sent for trial at the Sessions House. This was where the Old Bailey is today. Just very quickly, it was had no fourth wall, Sessions House. It was open to the elements to try and prevent jail fever. So it was only in the middle of the 18th century that that fourth wall was put in. He was tried, and just very quickly, I'll tell you what happened at the trial. It's very brief. He was indicted several times. This is on 13th of August 1724. The prosecutor, William Kneebone, said that the prisoner had some time since been his servant. On the 12th of July last, about 11 at night, I saw all my doors and windows fast and then went to bed. I was called up about 4 in the morning and found my house broke open, the bar of my cellar window having been cut, the bolts in my cellar door were drawn and the padlock wrenched off, the shutter in my shop was broken, 108 yards of woolen cloth, 2 silver spoons and other things were taken away. And then Jonathan Wild was a witness who knew nothing about it. Jonathan Wild said the prosecutor had come to him and he had tracked Jack Sheppard down. And then, interestingly, a man called William Field said this: the prisoner told me and Blueskin that he knew of a ken worth milling, that is a house worth breaking, for he said there was something good to be got in it. And so he carried us to take a view of the prosecutor's house, etc., etc. He tells a story as if he was involved in the robbery. He was never involved in that robbery. Jonathan Wild had employed this man to basically lie in court. And in fact, this man called Field lied in several cases. He was actually hanged himself. He was a professional witness. And when he told the same story at Blueskin Blake's trial, he told it differently, just so he could make sure he implicated the right person who was being tried. So Field was never there, but he basically got Sheppard condemned, and he was condemned to be hanged for his robberies. And there was no alternative, because he'd stolen so much money. The only alternative would be to transportation. They weren't going to transport him for stealing so many things worth so much money. So he was condemned to be hanged. But this is what happened. So he's sent back to Newgate, where he's kept in, this is on the ground floor, and those people who have been condemned were kept in a lock-up here. This up here is the tap, where the keepers could go and get a drink or gin from a woman who kept the tap. And it was, this is an 18th century, this is contemporary, this is exactly what it looked like. So as you can see, this little bit is just out of view from this group of keepers here. So visitors could come in and they could talk to the people behind these bars. Jack had got hold of a file from somewhere, who knows where, and he filed through one of these bars. Edgeworth Bess and another woman called Poll Maggott came to visit him. hauled him through the bars. The prisoners on the other side pushed him through as well. They had some spare women's clothes. He dressed as a woman. 2 of them left, and they were seen leaving, 2 women leaving. They'd seen 2 women arrive, they saw 2 women go. And a little while later, the 3rd woman left, and they didn't take any notice. So he got away. What he did was, he met up with another apprentice. They went to Northamptonshire to try and get away. People in Northamptonshire didn't want anything to do with them. They eventually came back to London, and Jack was caught instantly. He was spotted, a posse was sent out, and he was caught up near Tottenham Court Road. He was brought back to Newgate, and he was put in what they thought was the most secure cell in Newgate. This is a cell called the Castle, and he was chained to the floor with huge chains and padlocks. They'd come and see him, and he'd have his padlocks and chains off. He'd be walking around the cell. So they put some more on him, weighted down and put cuffs on him. But this is the castle. This is on what we now call the 4th floor, basically, of the 3rd floor of the prison. So this is where he is. There's nothing else going on in this part of the floor at all. And there's not much, most of the people are kept lower down. They put him here because they thought it was secure. So that's the room he's in, and that's the fireplace, that's the door. Those are the chains that he was fixed with. He had no trouble with these, mostly. He could slip off the cuffs, and he found a nail in the floor. He took the nail out of the floor, and he picked this lock here. But then he had chains around his legs. So he tied the chains to his legs so that it didn't impede him. And then he did this. He looked up the chimney. This is his great escape he's famous for. He looked up the chimney, and he realised it was stopped by a bar. So he started to pick away the bricks and stones that made the chimney piece. Eventually he demolished the whole chimney piece, pulled out the bar, and then basically burrowed his way up into the room above. So that's his leg disappearing up there. These images were produced days after his escape. So journalists came into the cells and employed somebody to draw them. So this is just days after. He appears in what's called the Red Room above. He comes out of the wall here. And he then has to get through this door here. That's this one. He's now got the iron bar that he found up the chimney, so he's able to prise the lock off here and pull back the bolt. So he's come out into this room. This is the next floor up. He's come up here, gone through, there would have been the door here, and he's heading down here. Now he would have known this part of the prison because this is a chapel area, and he would have been taken to the chapel every Sunday. They had a service there, so he knew this area. There was another door here to get into the chapel. This is the door here. He was on the other side of this door, but he managed to basically burrow his way round the door and pull back that bolt. He gets into the chapel. So this is the chapel. The chapel is divided up into pens. You've got different groups of prisoners, so debtors go in one pen, staff in another one, and those people who are condemned go in a different pen. So they're all locked, these doors. One of the doors, he just bursts through the door. He just throws all his weight against it and bursts through it. The next one he can't get through, so he climbs over the top of it, breaking off one of the spikes, which he's going to use as a tool later. So he's come down here, he's gone into the chapel. This is a later plan, but very similar to how the setup would have been. He probably had to go through parts of these, but he's heading for this bit here. This is a corridor that heads off. Whether he knew where he was going at this point, he may never have gone down that corridor, but clearly he knew he was on the top of the prison, and he was just trying to find some way out. This one, this is the lockbox, which was on here. He just prized it off using those bits of tools he'd found and just broke it. Now, you've got to remember, this is at night, it's pitch black, the moon certainly wasn't full, it was probably not even out at all. So lots of times he's feeling his way, or just allowing a bit of light that's coming through some of these very small windows. He's relying on his knowledge of how things are put together because he's a carpenter. When he gets through this door, it's probably there or there, the door. As I say, this is a later map, so he's heading down here. The next one, which is a really strong door, has a huge fillet of metal that fits over here, in which the lock fits in. He attacked this clearly for a very long time, and eventually, he was trying to break it, he eventually ripped off the whole piece of metal, which was 7 feet long and 7 inches broad and 2 inches thick, as it says here. Ripped it off, and then could open that door. So he's heading down here, this corridor. He's heading for this bit here. This is the last door he has to get through. That's bolted on the inside. So it opens the door. He can't get up these stairs, it's got spikes at the top. So he climbs on top of the door. And these are called the lower leads, i.e. the flat roof. He gets onto the upper leads up here. So he's up here. This is right on the top of Newgate Prison, 60 feet in the air. He looks over this wall. The perspective is a bit weird here. He's trying to show you a view over the wall from the top of the prison. He looks over the wall and he realises that that's too far for him to jump down onto the houses that are next to the prison. So what he does, which is incredibly brave, he goes back to his cell. He goes through all those broken doors, through the chapel, down through the chimney, back to his cell. He gets his blanket and all the way back up. Using the spike that he's got from the chapel, he sticks the blanket into the brickwork here. He lowers himself down onto the house of Mr. Bird, who is a turner by trade, and he hides in the attics. And then late at night, about 1 o'clock in the morning, he hears somebody going out of the street door. He basically just runs down the stairs and bolts out of the street door and runs off, and he gets away. This is a late 18th century image that actually shows the back of Newgate, where he escaped from. This is one of only 2 images that show that side of Newgate, and this is him coming down here onto the house, and then he's there and runs out here. He had to wait because the shops were still open at this time. They opened really late in 18th century London, and so there would have been lights in there. So we know how that escaped because when the keepers came in the morning, they found extraordinarily he'd escaped and just followed his route. They got the press in basically to say, look, this is what he did. We weren't negligent, they probably were, but he made a remarkable escape. While he was escaping, he was not visited much because the sessions were going on, and at that sessions, Blueskin Blake was being tried, and Blueskin Blake, in the court, tried to cut the throat of Jonathan Wild. In fact, he nearly succeeded, and Jonathan Wild was had to be attended by a surgeon who stitched it up there and then in the court. Blueskin Blake was hanged after this. Unfortunately, Jack went back to exactly where he was living, and he was arrested a few days later after committing a few crimes, drunk again in a bar. He was brought back to Newgate, and this time he was watched all the time, which I think they would have learned their lesson. He was watched all the time, chained down. He now had become incredibly famous. Can you imagine that this is coming out in the papers as it happens? Nothing else is allowed in the papers. They don't report any political news. All we report is what the king got up to, a few runaways, apprentices, and reports on crimes. So the whole of London is completely obsessed with this story now, particularly as he's regarded as very small, cheeky. They quote what things he said to people, and the fact he wasn't committing anything particularly grand, like murdering anybody or particularly nasty highway robbery. He was just breaking into people's houses, so he becomes a bit of an anti-hero because he keeps escaping. He becomes so famous that when he's in prison for the last time, the King's painter, Sir James Thornhill, comes and visits him and draws his portrait, and this is a facsimile of the portrait he drew. That was worked up into a more finished drawing, and then that was given to another artist who turned it into a mezzotin print. Yeah, and what you can see, actually, I think is interesting. His features are much cruder there. They get a bit smoothed out, and becomes more childlike, and becomes more innocent as you go through the various stages. So lots of people go and visit him. They pay to visit him. They pay 3 and 6 to go and visit him just to see this most famous person in the whole country. But they have to prove that he is the same person they tried, because he's escaped between this trial. So he gets sent to Westminster Hall, to the King's Bench Court, and when he's sent there, he has to travel in a carriage. The crowd starts to gather, and they think he's being taken off to be hanged quickly, or something's going to happen to him. The crowd follow them to Westminster Hall. He's recognised as the same person. They prove he is the same person. But the Lord Chancellor is at the other end of Westminster Hall, spots this celebrity and says, "Can I meet him?" So the Lord Chancellor meets him. And Jack says, they say to Jack, "Tell us who your accomplices were on your escape." He says, "Nobody helped me. They said, how do you get out of your chains? He said, if you want to, wait a minute, I'll show you now. And he offered to show them how he got out of his chains. They refused. They sent him back to Newgate, now they recognised him as the same person, with a new date for hanging. The government had stepped in and said, look, let's get this sorted out. The ministers were involved, let's get this man hanged because he's far too popular. On the way back to Westminster, more crowds gathered because they've heard he's gone to Westminster. There was a bit of a riot, they have to call the army out. Somebody's leg is broken in the crowd, and they crush the crowd. He goes back to Newgate, where he's watched all the time, changed to the floor. And then on the 16th of November, 1724, he's sent to be executed at Tyburn. He's going to be hanged. It takes him hours and hours to get there because 200,000 people turn up to see him. And they line the route from basically just down the road from here, all the way to the end of Oxford Street, to Marble Arch, where that is now, that's where Tyburn was. Along the way, he was planning a final escape. When they searched him before he got into the tumbrel, so here he is sitting in the tumbrel, they were just sort of searching like this. The person searching him cut his finger on something just down here on his jacket. When they investigated it, he had a blade hidden in the hem of his jacket. He was going to cut the ropes that he was tied up with, and when he got to a place just along Holborn called Little Turnstile, it's still there, Little Turnstile, he was going to jump out of the cart and run through Little Turnstile into Lincoln's Inn Fields. He wanted to do it there because Little Turnstile was so narrow, people on horseback couldn't follow him. So that was his last, virtually last attempt. That didn't work because they found the blade. He arrives at Tyburn, and this is Hogarth's famous picture of Tyburn. And he still expected that some friends might be able to cut him down quickly because he was so light, and you hanged by strangulation. There was no drop, as in modern hangings or modern hangings. One modern hanging, your neck breaks when you're hanged. Basically, the drop breaks your neck, you're dead virtually instantly. In the 18th century, you stood on a cart, they put it loose around your neck, and the cart just went away. There was no drop, so you died through strangulation. He hoped that if they cut him down quickly, he could be rushed off to a pub, wrapped in blankets and warmed up. That's what they thought. They could bring him back to life by keeping him warm. So he was hanged, and he took a very long time. He was so slight, it took a long time. People hung on his legs to try and speed it up for him, those people who were may have been friends with him, who didn't know about this plan to revive him. But when they went to cut him down, the mob who had arrived thought that he was being cut down in order to be taken to the surgeons, because they took people who had been hanged to surgeons so they could be anatomised. When they saw this happening, and he was such a hero, there was a complete riot over his body. The mob got his body, and it took all the evening to get it back, and had to call the army out again. They eventually retrieved in Longacre. And he was buried that night in St Martin's in the Fields, and his coffin was found in 1866 when they built the National Portrait Gallery. And he was said to be lying back next to a famous banker, which they thought was really suitable, that a criminal should be lying next to a banker. I think that's a Victorian invention, and they knew these people were buried there, and when they dug them up. They dug them up because they had to remove them to build the National Portrait Gallery. He's now lying in Brookwood Cemetery, unmarked. There's just an area that's marked as bodies from St Martin's in the Fields. So that was the end of Jack Sheppard. And we've sort of run out of time. I'll very quickly say about his legend. He lives on in pantomimes. He lives on in 19th century Newgate calendars, stories of criminals. He becomes more famous than Dick Turpin. In the 19th century, he was the most famous criminal of all. He appears in little leaflets like this in the 19th century. And then he appears in a novel by William Harrison Ainsworth called Jack Sheppard. And Ainsworth's novel is the most successful novel of the period. It outsold Oliver Twist, which was coming out at the same time. It was so successful that they put on so many productions in the West End of this novel that in 1839-40 you could have gone into the West End, you could have seen a different production every night of the week and still have about 3 or 4 to see. So there were about 10 productions all at once. So a bit like Andrew Lloyd Webber. So he became incredibly famous. He became the byword for somebody who could escape. And throughout the 19th century, everybody knew who he was, right down from Big Victoria right down to the crossing sweeper. These are just images from the novel. You can see he's used. This is Cruikshank illustrating the story, using images based on those prints that I've shown you from the contemporary He appears in lots of plays. This is him becoming more glamorous in various 19th century plays. He was played by women on several occasions, a bit like in pantomimes where women took the male lead. This is Mary Ann Keeley, who performed him until the age of 55. She was still performing him. He appeared in comics. So this is a sort of Penny Dreadfuls type comic from the 19th century. He appeared in a French book called Chevalier de Brulard, which means the Knights in the Fog, where he looks a lot like D'Artagnan. And my favourite picture in the French version is of Dollis Hill, which looks like a Schloss on the Rhine. He appeared in other plays under different titles. He appeared in little musicals, like this one, Nellie Farron playing Jack Sheppard. Right now these are sort of comic musicals. That's Nellie Farron playing Jack Sheppard. Weedon Grossmith playing Jack Sheppard on the stage. Weedon Grossmith, who wrote Diary of a Nobody, he played Jack Sheppard. He appeared in 20th century comics. These are early 20th century comics. When Houdini came to this country, he was challenged to escape from Jack Sheppard's chains. This is a picture of him with Jack Sheppard's chains, which were meant to have been kept at Newgate and subsequently kept at the Old Bailey, but they don't seem to have them anymore. They may be in the Museum of London. Houdini had no problem escaping from his chains, and Houdini becomes, in the 20th century, the person we associate with this escapology. In the 19th and 18th century, it was Jack Sheppard. So that's one of the reasons lots of us have forgotten about Jack Sheppard, because Houdini replaces him. He was a musical artist, did a funny turn about Jack Sheppard, which is recorded in 1912. In 1928, he was played on the stage at the Elizabeth Castle. He appears in a film with Tommy Steele called Where's Jack, which is a terrible film, I'm afraid. It doesn't have any songs, but they don't include The Great Escape that I just showed you. It doesn't appear in the film. Fancy making a Jack Sheppard film when it doesn't appear like that. He appears in sort of popular history, The Road to Tyburn. On the stage in the 1980s with Neil Pearson playing Jack Sheppard. He appears in a documentary called Invitation to a Hanging in about 2003. And then in a children's book, finally. So he's gone from being a criminal right down to being in a children's book, which was produced about 3 years ago. And that, as fast as I could do it, is the story of Jack Sheppard.